is for health reasons. So this is just one example of that, a nationally representative survey that was done by colleagues at Johns Hopkins University. And you can see here kind of the proportion of people reporting various reasons for reducing meat consumption. And of course, cost, we know, is the #1 determinant of what foods people eat. But moving that aside, health is a really big part of the reason that people reduce meat. And so maybe if our end goal is to reduce meat consumption, cost and health are probably, based on this consumer side research, the levers that we might want to tweak in order to nudge people to reduce animal source foods, and particularly meat consumption is what I've been most interested in. So we have done recently some experiments in US samples. So that's why there's a Tesco branding on our experiment images here, because people in the US don't know what Tesco is, and we needed a we just needed a standard brand on these food products. So we've been running experiments in US samples where we expose people to, in a randomized experiment fashion, to warning labels. And we originally were thinking, we'll just do warning labels around health, like you see on, tobacco products, so alcohol products, other, products along those lines. What if we stick some warning labels on meat products, especially processed meat products, which we know are strongly related to colon and rectal cancer and premature mortality from cardiovascular disease. So what if we stick these warning labels on meat products? Will we see an impact? And will the impact be greater than if we stick a warning label related to environmental impact? So for example, a warning label that says eating red meat increases your carbon footprint. So we ran a couple thousand Americans through these experiments. This is one of the first experiments that we did. So again, just they're seeing these warning labels. And one of the key findings was that, as expected based on that nationally representative survey I mentioned, the health warning labels were much more effective than the environmental warning labels. And not only in terms of perceived effectiveness, but also in terms of intention to reduce red meat consumption. The health warning messages were the most effective at reducing consumption. And we've also run some choice experiments. So we put people through an experiment where we show them 3 different burritos, one burrito that has beef in it, one that has poultry, and one that has is plant-based and has beans in it. And so we say, of these of 3 burritos, which one would you most like to buy? Choose one. And we randomize if they see a warning label, particularly on the beef product, given its strong association with health outcomes and higher carbon footprint as compared to poultry. So we run them through this experiment. Unfortunately, we haven't found that even in very large, well-powered samples, we have not found significant effects of those warning labels. Certainly the health message is performing the best, but, the health message is not performing the best, sorry. The health message is performing the best. So they're least likely to select the beef burrito as compared to control. So 45% of controls choose the beef burrito, and only 40% of those who get the health warning message. But these effects are really small. So I think what we're finding is that even with these warning labels, which are generally considered super strong behavioral nudgers, we're not seeing big effects in terms of meat consumption in the US. One thing along these lines also I wanted to point out, there's a group here in Scotland at University of Aberdeen that I've recently become familiar with, who's doing some really cool modeling, looking at the impact of social marketing campaigns to reduce red meat consumption in Scotland specifically. So they're running some agent-based models. And their early results, this is from a poster that they presented at the Oxford Leap Symposium on Reducing Meat. And you can see here that in terms of mean weekly meat consumption, similar to that slide that I just showed for our beef burrito selection experiment, the health is definitely the lowest in terms of meat consumption in their social marketing campaigns. So if you do social marketing campaigns around the health effects of meat as a trigger for trying to get people to reduce meat consumption, it seems to perform better, even in Scotland, than emphasizing the environment or even animal welfare. So I think that the conclusion of this, these couple of studies that I'm showing and that our research group's evidence and this group over at Aberdeen are continuing to show is that if our end goal is to reduce consumption of animal source foods, I think that it seems promising to focus on sustainability because the evidence is very clear on the sustainability aspects for the high levels of particularly ruminant meat consumption. But it may not be the most effective approach for actually changing behavior. People really care about their health and nutritional status and disease risk. And so maybe because there also, particularly for red meat, is some health benefit to reducing meat consumption, perhaps we can get a win-win by emphasizing the health impacts to reduce the meat consumption, which will also have a win for the environmental impacts. And then I'm just going to close, because I am a nutritionist, with the second question, which is, if you eliminate animal source foods, what are you going to replace them with? And so this part of my research is really looking at substitution behaviors and trying to understand more about particularly these biomimicry products like the Impossible Burger, which hasn't been approved for sale in the UK yet, but Beyond Burgers and things like that. These products that are ultra processed, are they really, if our outcome is health, they may be a win for the environment, but not a win for health, or at least we don't know. The evidence is still up in the air. And I think that what this comes to, this is a really great paper that some colleagues of mine over at Harvard did, where they kind of graded people who were on plant-based diets according to this index about whether or not it was healthful or unhealthful. So of course you can have a super unhealthy vegan diet, right? You can eat chips and nothing else. Like you could have cereal in the morning with soy milk and then like chips for lunch and chips for dinner or something, and it would be super unhealthy. And so I think that when I talk about plant-based diets from a health perspective, I always try to emphasize that it's not just about reducing red meat, for example, or reducing animal source products. It's really about what you substitute it with. And you have to be conscious of not substituting the animal products that you're eliminating from your diet or reducing from your diet with super unhealthy products. And so this study looked at, kind of classified plant-based diets according to healthfulness. And what you can see is that the high healthfulness plant-based diets, so plant-based diets that are high in fruits and vegetables and whole grains, legumes and nuts, for those you definitely see a clear lower risk as you go up on that score. But people who have unhealthy plant-based diets that are high in fried foods, refined grains, and added sugars, for example, they actually have a higher risk compared to controls who are eating, a standard typical American diet. And so not all plant-based diets are created equal. And I think you really have to emphasize that not all plant-based foods are healthy, or they're not, the processing that can happen to whole plant-based foods can make them unhealthy. And so it's not just about reducing or eliminating animal foods, but it's about replacing them with healthy plant-based options. Oh, and sorry, I just wanted to show one more study, which I think some of you may have heard about and relates to a project that we're trying to get a PhD studentship to support looking at in UK Biobank. So stay tuned for more updates there for those of you who are interested. But I'm very interested in understanding the long-term health effects of these biomimicry products. So some of you may have heard that the National Institutes of Health over in the US recently ran a really interesting randomized control trial where they gave people similar diets in terms of all, macronutrients and micronutrients and kind of components of the diet, but one of them was ultra processed and the other was unprocessed. And the ultra processed is in blue here and unprocessed in red. And what you can see is that there's something inherent in processing food, independent of the calories or the sugar, fat, whatever in the food. There's something about the ultra processing nature of it that leads people to eat more food than they need in order to achieve energy balance. So you can see the ultra processed diet has higher energy intake and was therefore associated with an increase in body weight over time. And so this sort of study, which is really the first of its kind, it makes me a little bit worried about these ultra processed biomimicry meat products. And I think that we just need to get a little bit more evidence about what the long-term impacts of those products may be on health. And so we're going to try and look at that in the UK Biobank cohort, because it's a unique sample in that in the UK, these biomimicry products have been around for a long time. And for example, corn products, although corn products are much healthier nutritionally than things like the Impossible Burger. But I think we just need to understand, because they are definitely ultra processed foods. So we need to understand, what are the long-term implications of eating those foods? And it again goes back to the substitution. Are you substituting a Beyond Burger or an Impossible Burger for your beef burger, or are you eating a legume burger? The health impacts will be very different. So I think that we need to kind of think carefully about where are we going to shift the population. We have a bad history of this in nutrition, of doing these substitutions with plant-based products. So think of margarines, for example. We said, nutritionists said, butter is really bad for you. It's high in saturated fat. Don't eat butter. So then they introduced, partially hydrogenated plant oils that were solids at room temperature and therefore could replace butter. But turns out they were super high in trans fat, which is the most potent cardiovascular disease risk factor. I mean, it's really potent. The one thing that nutritionists agree on is that trans fat is very bad. So there are a lot of bans now. Even the US has banned trans fat in the food supply. They've banned artificial trans fat in the food supply. So I just want to avoid having another trans fat where we push everyone to eat these biomimicry products that are better for the environment, but turn out to be really nasty for health. So that's kind of a small flavor of what we're working on, really from a health perspective, because we know that that's something that consumers care a lot about. And then if we are going to push people to reduce meat, trying to figure out what they're going to reduce it with, and how can we maximize the health benefits of that. So looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you. That was really interesting, and it also kind of made me realize that we can do a lot of innovative and new cutting edge research and try and find solutions for something, but even the solutions themselves have inherent problems with them. So thank you for that very much. And also congratulations. Lyndsay recently won a fellowship, so it's really exciting to have her come in and discuss that. I think we also had one quick question. Someone asked, are you vegan?
I'm not vegan. I admittedly come from a family of dairy farmers in upstate New York. And so I do consume milk products, and I occasionally consume fish. I don't consume red meat or poultry, but the red meat mostly for health reasons, the chicken mostly out of habit. So I think that in general, my stance, mostly because I come at this from a nutritional and environmental perspective rather than the ethical perspective, My stance is always reducing, but not eliminating meat products particularly. So yeah, I am not vegan. Yeah.
All right, thank you, thank you. Next up, we're going to have Mr. Peter Ritchie from Whitmuir Organic Farm, just to kind of give his own perspectives and weigh in on this discussion. So thank you.
That's great. Listen, thank you for having me, and thank you, Emma and Lyndsay, for your talks. Really helpful. Lyndsay, it was great irony that you used Tesco, you know, for that thing. As you said, a brand not known in the US. They lost so much money trying to go to the US. It's so funny. They would really like that. And
yeah.
And just a comment, really interesting, I think, your stuff at the end about ultra processed and unprocessed diets, because in animal nutrition, and all your colleagues at GAFS will be right across this, we've always distinguished between digestible energy and metabolizable energy. So how much, you know, what energy there would be in the feed that we give an animal, and how much energy the animal can take out of it, because obviously we use a certain amount of energy through our gut microbiome digesting it, and some of it's undigestible even with our gut. So you know, ultra processed diets by definition are basically all digestible. That's why they've been processed. So it's not surprising in a sense that we end up eating more calories, because we're not doing any work to digest them, and it obviously screws up our gut microbiome really badly too. So I think, Emma, you're right. Just stick to vegetables, really. I mean, that's the thing. And the sad thing is that, you know, in Veganuary last year, actually UK veg consumption fell. You know, yeah, sorry. So vegan doesn't equal vegetable consumption, unfortunately. There's a real issue there. Anyway, I'm just going to talk, I just want to say a couple of things about Nourish, just because although I live on at Whitmuir Farm, and that's how Julian got hold of me. My day job is working for Nourish Scotland. And if you haven't heard of it, have a look at our website. If you're interested in food systems, because that's what we do. We focus mainly on our work in Scotland, although we're doing a bit of work at the moment in the run up to the COP in Glasgow on food and climate change. And we do quite a lot of different things. So at the moment, we're working a lot on ending the need for food banks in Scotland, and trying to make sure that if people do have to get food, they get it with dignity. We also got a project called Peas Please, which is about increasing veg consumption in the UK. We spent 15 years in the UK having 5 a day, which is now officially the best known public health slogan in the world, I think. But it hasn't made any difference to vegetable consumption, which is a bit of a sad thing for all of us who think that telling people things makes a difference. So we've tried another tack, which is basically much more the sort of supply side end, and going to work with the retailers and the caterers to help them make changes to make it easier for people to eat their veg. And that's been an interesting project. And what's been noticeable, I think, as you said, Emma, in the last 2 or 3 years even, you've seen some of this stuff becoming mainstream. So we were talking to one of the big international caterers this morning about the menu at the COP, and they were, they're so keen to have a plant-forward menu and to minimize, animal proteins in the menu. And this is a big international caterer. They've got it. They've completely got it. Tesco's already putting out products which are sort of minced with carrots, which are advertising as, for people who want to eat less meat. So they've got it too, and they've committed to halving the environmental footprint of the UK shopping basket in a joint project with WWF. So it's really important to realize that you're not on your own here. That things are changing. They're not changing maybe as quickly as you'd like, but the argument is being won that we need to move beyond the sort of diets that we have at the moment, including, as I think you mentioned, Emma, the horrific levels of food waste, which, on their own, if we could do something to reduce those, would be good. And I want to say, in case anything I say sort of comes across as like, critical or negative anyway, I'm not vegan. I'm definitely a flexitarian, although I'm a farmer and I grow animals for a living. I don't eat many of them. I don't eat them very often. And I hate killing them. So some of the paradoxes about actually keeping livestock, you appreciate when you keep them too, because it's a very complicated sort of relationship that we have with our animals. But I suppose I want to say that, things are changing, and it's really encouraging to have so many people on call in the evening to talk about this stuff. Because I mean, we cared a lot about stuff as students, but we didn't care about this stuff. We cared about nuclear weapons and the miners' strike and, racism and oil, and we cared about lots of things, but we hadn't really got that the food system mattered so much. And so it's really great to see that. My son, who worked on the farm for a bit, is now studying at university, and I hope isn't on the call tonight, you know, has also moved hugely in the last few months to say, you know, we've got to cut down on meat, Dad. You know, I've got to eat 7 a day, and, you know, going to stay healthy and going to stay alive, and what are you doing still eating meat, Dad, and all this stuff. So things are definitely changing. Anyway, I wanted to show you a couple of slides, and hopefully that will spark a conversation. And I do have to apologize. I've got another meeting starting just after 8, so I'm going to have to leave you, but happy to take a couple of questions this time. So, okay, can people see that all right? Yeah?
Yes.
Yep.
Yes.
Great, okay. So this is from Lyndsay's amazing colleague, Hannah Ritchie, who's now at Edinburgh University, who's done a lot of work on our world in data. And it's just a brilliant set of resources for anybody who wants to get a snapshot of what's really going on. Hannah's just great at collating and presenting that data. So it's great stuff. And this just shows you globally what's going on in terms of energy use and greenhouse gas emissions. And what you can see in there is that globally, the way we use our land, Emma was talking about land use, is about 20%. And within that, livestock's an important part. But obviously, these agricultural soils emissions, a lot of that comes from animal feed as well. And then we still do crop burning. We do heather burning in Scotland. We do crop burning in India and other parts of the world. And obviously, we're still cutting down big swathes of trees, some of which is to convert to livestock production in Latin America, for example, or to palm oil production in Southeast Asia. And then some of these emissions from cropland, a lot to do with nitrogen use. So yes, agriculture is a big part of overall greenhouse gas emissions, and within that, livestock isn't just these direct emissions from methane, but also some of the other emissions from that. So plenty more data in there if you go into our world in data. Yeah, so this is what, to say I do it for a living, hang on a minute, I'm going to go back and tell you about that calf a minute. So as calf born first day, basically what happens in our farm is that our farm starts at 900 feet up, so that's just higher than Arthur's Seat, and we're on a north-facing slope. This is our flat field. So, and you can grow wheat on it occasionally, not every year, maybe 1 year in 4, but on our scale of farm, there'd be actually no point in growing wheat because our costs of production are about £500 a ton, and we get £250 a ton for it. So I mean, it's just like, it's not, we don't have any way to dry it, we don't have a combine, we're not big enough to grow cereals with the technology that's around at the moment. So we grow grass, and overall the farm is carbon neutral, which is probably, well, it's carbon positive at the moment. We have huge amounts of hedges, we have trees planting, and we're just about to put another third of our plant farm into trees. Partly because Ewan said, we've got to plant more trees and have less cows, Dad, so that's what we're doing. That's the trouble with young people, they just go on and on and on, I'm sorry, till they persuade you that they're right and you're wrong. So we're not actually cutting down our cows because we're just, but we're not increasing them. We can cope with what we've got. But there is something wonderful, and I know it's really difficult, people have different views about this. For me, there's something absolutely wonderful about this new life. That calf, that was a heifer, a girl calf. So that will spend 2 years of its life, would spend the first year entirely with its mum, and then when its mum has a new calf, it'll spend the next year of its life partly with its mum, because they keep in the herd, they also keep in family groups. It'll be in field, it'll have shelter and access to trees, whatever field it's in on the farm. For about 5 months in the winter, it'll be in a straw shed inside. When it's frosty, they can go out and walk on the ground. If they go out when it's wet in the winter, they damage the ground and produce a lot of carbon emissions apart from everything else. So it's going to have a good life, and then it will either have babies of its own or it'll get turned into meat. That's what lies ahead of that calf. I just want to say a little bit more about land use. Emma's point about land use. Our land, we grow quite a few veg in a small area of the farm, in polytons mostly for direct sale. We couldn't grow veg on a commercial scale because, again, the soil isn't good enough, the climate's not good enough. We have a very heavy clay soil. But our farm, like a lot of Scotland, is much more suitable for growing grass than it is for growing anything else. And For us, that means that the ruminants represent, if you like, a least opportunity cost livestock. If you're going to have animals to eat, then as Emma says, it doesn't make sense to grow grain to feed animals. You might as well eat the grain yourself. But we can't eat grass, and we certainly can't eat trees. And cows love trees, and they selectively graze different trees depending on the time of year. Sorry, I'm not very good with the old video. I think she bumped into me at this point. Anyway, you get the point. They love trees, and they will selectively eat them if they can. So, but on land use, just going on, I hope you can see this. Again, I can send you the slides, Julian, for going up. But we did a project on a farm looking at 2,000 meters squared, because that's, at the moment, if you divided the amount of arable land, that's land you can sensibly plow in the world, by the number of people in the world, that gives us 2,000 square meters each. And so that's a really interesting way of trying to conceptualize, you know, if you like, our share of the planet. There is more arable land available. There's probably about the same again available, particularly in the Sahel and other areas that are rain-fed, where you could do farming. Parts of the former USSR are really underfarmed at the moment. So there's spare land in the world. We just don't use it because it's a long way from markets. But at the moment, this is the amount of arable land we have. And then we have about twice as much pasture land per person in the planet. That grass, which really doesn't make sense to plow, either because it's too steep, or because the soil's too thin, or because the weather's really not suitable for growing grains. It's really hard to grow some crops where it's very, very wet, and particularly in some of the northern countries. So, but this is across the world, this is what we use our land to grow. And as Lyndsay and others would know, this bit up here about nuts and fruits, and this bit here, vegetables, this is the bit we need to expand globally if we're going to meet our dietary needs. At the moment, we're eating, you know, we eat a lot of calories, but not enough fruit, veg, and nuts. But when you look at how this land is divided up, most of this wheat and most of this maize and quite a lot of the other cereals, and quite a lot of the oilseed, unfortunately, and most of the soybean goes to feed animals. So a big chunk of that goes to feed animals. When you look at what we grow in Scotland, it's an even scarier picture, because there's our little fruit and vegetables. We don't have much arable land in Scotland. We have 1,200 meters squared per person in Scotland. So most of Scotland, as I said before, is for growing grass, or for, you know, not doing anything at all, or for growing trees on. You know, we're not greatly favoured with arable land in Scotland, although on the land we've got, we grow an enormous amount of vegetables. We grow peas, we grow sweet potatoes, we grow carrots. We are, you know, we've got some fantastic vegetable growers, but we don't have much land for it. We don't use much land for it. We use more land for crops like turnips to feed animals. We grow a bit for oats. Most of that goes to humans, although some goes to animals. We grow potatoes, which is great. We grow the rapeseed oil, as I said, although some of that, again, ends up either the rapeseed itself or the byproducts go to animal feed. Most of the wheat goes to animal feed. We grow very little wheat in Scotland for human consumption, and almost all of the barley goes either for whiskey or for animal feed. So the land we've got, which isn't very much, we use nearly all of it either for whiskey or animal feed. So it's just the land choices we make are all about economics and about what makes sense for farmers to grow, but it's just a sort of sobering thought. Okay, so I'm just going to make a few statements, and happy to take some questions on. But basically, the first thing to remember is there is no technical problem feeding the world. You know, if we had a nuclear exchange in South Asia or a massive volcanic eruption, you know, like, or a meteor, or, you know, a sort of dinosaur killing event, then obviously we'd be in deep doo-doo. But, you know, the problems with feeding the world, even with feeding the world a much better diet than people have now, is not a technical problem. It's simply a problem of organization and structure and politics. You know, we have a reserve army of hunger in the world, and we've had that for a very long time. So, but we could, you know, there's really no problem. Land's being taken out of production in the north, in the USA, in Canada, in Europe, at quite a significant rate at the moment. And there's a huge yield gap, and we could be far, far more on the land we've got if we wanted to. there are sort of practical solutions to some of the stuff, particularly around the impact of cattle and ruminants. If you had a relatively slow reduction in UK or EU meat consumption, which is what the group 50 by 40 is asking for, they're asking for 50% reduction globally by 2040. That frees up land the size of Italy in Europe for nature, biodiversity, rewilding, whatever you want to do with it, but also allows everyone in Europe to farm organically. So the 50% reduction in meat consumption transforms our option space for how we use our land in the world. This point I'm making about ruminants, they're the least cost option livestock if they're fed on grass. And if you mix the farm with trees like we do, then the farm as a whole is carbon neutral. And they're also useful in sort of organic arable systems for rotations. If you're growing cereals, you really don't want to grow cereals every year because you end up using a lot of pesticides. You also end up depleting your soil carbon. If you put grass into rotation, you rebuild your soil carbon, you rebuild your soil health, and you get rid of some of the diseases that you'd otherwise have in your cereal crops. And using livestock to eat that grass is a reasonably sensible thing to do, in my opinion. But there's a big question, and it comes out in all the international debates about red meat and white meat, and which is more sustainable. And as you said, Emma, we feed chickens and pigs on food we could eat, very high quality, high protein food that would perfectly well, I've eaten our pig food. It's not enjoyable, but it's as nice as Weetabix, really. I mean, same sort of thing, probably higher in protein, and it's because it's organic. It's certainly cheaper than Weetabix. But yeah, we're eating, we're giving pigs food so we stopped doing pigs now because we just thought the pigs are really nice, they have a really good life, but this is actually ridiculous. But the argument is always that poultry and pigs are better. When you look at the way that we keep poultry and pigs in the world, I think there's an entirely moral argument for saying these are not lives worth living. The average chicken gets 37 days of life in the dark, surrounded by 100,000 other chickens before it gets sort of picked up, hung upside down, put through a bath of water and electrocuted. It's not a great life for a chicken. And pigs, for the most part, similarly, I think it's either a 10-story or 100-story pig farm that's just been approved in Beijing. There's a lot of very, very intensive farming going on for these animals that are, when you meet them and when you work with them and when you have them, they're incredibly smart, sentient, individual, funny animals. And the thought of them living that sort of life is not good. We can reduce feed climate impact from ruminants, anything from 30 to 90%, depending on how some of the feed additives turn out when they're applied at scale, and depending on what system you're running. But there's some world-leading work in Edinburgh at the moment on animal genetics that looks at how you can measure the genetic propensity of animals to emit methane, and that some animals are 40% less than others. So if you can get those genes into the breeding herd, then that makes a huge difference. So there's technical things you can do, but the real question is whether it's a moral claim not to eat or exploit animals, even if they've had a life worth living. And I think if people think that's a perfectly reasonable thing to think, but it's not an argument about practicalities or technicalities. It's just about, it's about values and beliefs. And it's absolutely right that people who believe that should also feel that they maybe should persuade other people to believe that too. I have nothing against that. I just think it's not where I am at the moment, but it's a perfectly sensible place to be. And then finally, I just want to say about individual political action. It's important to do both, and it's important to have some coherence to do with both. But you're a great society. At the moment, Edinburgh University is thinking about making a Peace Please pledge about how to change its catering to move it more towards vegetarian and veg-based diets. That's quite a small goal, but actually changing the way that Edinburgh University eats isn't the worst thing to do. And then there's changing the way Scotland eats and changing the way the world eats. But there's a lot of political opportunities at the moment to influence the future of food. So I'd really encourage you to make good choices individually, but also make good choices politically. Thank you.
Thank you, Pete. Thank you. That was a really good presentation. You did spark my curiosity over pig feed, but I think the stat on Italy was something that was really interesting. If we just do 50 by 40, Pete's going to have to leave us soon, so if you do have any questions, please drop them in the chat or just raise up your hand. We'll just give that a moment. Otherwise, next up, we're going to go into a short break, and then we'll come back for just a question and answer session with our panelists. And after that, we'll just end with a few announcements and end the session. All right, there's one question for you, Pete. Do you think it will ever be possible to achieve veganism on a global scale? If yes, do you see any major environmental problems that could arise from that?
Yeah, I think it's completely possible. I mean, it's really hard to know, isn't it, what's going to happen in terms of what we think is socially acceptable. You know, you know, although we're always sort of confronted by problems in the world, you know, some things have got better. You know, some forms of human cruelty, you know, we're trying to get rid of. You know, we're trying to change. There's some things which are just no longer acceptable. You know, when, you know, people my age who grew up in Scotland were regularly beaten in school. It was just seen as that's what we do to children. We beat them, you know, and that's the way to get them to learn. You know, now as parents, you're not to smack your children, and that's entirely right. You know, that's been in a couple of generations, that complete change in what we think it's okay to do with children. You know, so it's absolutely possible that the world, you know, by 2100 will have just given up, you know, doing a lot of stuff with meat. I think there'll be some loss, because I think there's some joy that farm animals and working with livestock produces in the world that I think is important. There'll be some animals that, you know, won't have a life that would have had a life, but, you know, it's entirely possible. In terms of the environment, yeah, we'd have an awful lot of forests back, you know, because we wouldn't need to grow food on them. So yeah, the transition could be quite tough, but if it's gradual, everybody will adapt, it'd be fine. Yeah, little and half farm carbon neutral. Yeah, Dylan. Yeah, it's just that if you look at the rate at which trees lock up carbon, it depends a bit on the species and the growth class and the, you know, the area you live in and the rainfall and all of those things. But, you know, it can be something around 3 tons a hectare per year. So if you have roughly, you know, we're very low stock. So if you have a quarter of your farm in trees, as we do, then it's not that hard to mop up the methane emissions with the carbon sequestration. But we've got a farming friend up in Perthshire who has a lot of trees on his farm, and his carbon footprint came out something like minus 3,000 tons or something, although he's got cattle and sheep. So yeah, it's possible to balance those things off. You know, you could still argue, well, get rid of the cattle and then you'd have an even more positive carbon footprint. So, you know, it doesn't in a sense prove anything, but it does mean that certainly our that way of farming is, you know, at a farm level is carbon neutral.
All right, thanks, Pete. I think we'll just kind of cut it off there.
But listen, can I just say, Julian, I mean, to everybody here, you know, my email, I put it in the chat box, and, you know, I'm really happy. I'm sorry I've got to go now, but I'm really happy for people to email me questions if they want or not, or go on the Nourish website, and then, you know, I'll be happy to come back to people. I'm really sorry I have to head off.
Sorry, Julian.
Yes.
Hi. I'd just like to, hi, let me just quickly introduce myself. My name is Paul Neate. I'm a development communications specialist, if that means anything. I'm an editor and writer. I spent about 35 years working in international agricultural research and development centres around the world. Just a general comment on some of the things that have been said here. It's a very northern perspective that's being presented in terms of the dietary impact and everything, the need to reduce meat consumption, and livestock products. There are a lot of cases where a small amount of livestock source foods can make an enormous difference to child development, development and maintenance of cognitive ability. There's a vast amount of studies on that. So, you know, I think we need to balance between this sort of this northern view where we've got massive overconsumption of calories, of proteins, and all the rest of it. We need to recognize the differences between livestock production systems, between the Northern European, North American model of very intensive production of feeding the animals on grains and concentrate feeds that have been produced using resources that could be used to produce directly consumable human food. But contrast that, be aware of systems, for example, across the Sahel, there's vast areas there where it is just simply not practical, it's not environmentally sustainable to grow crops. Livestock are the only well-managed livestock is the only appropriate way of using that land to generate a livelihood for people. And even where there is cropping, for example, in Niger, where the Fulani herdsmen are paid by crop farmers to corral their livestock on cropland to transfer nutrients from the broader rangelands to concentrate it on crop fields. Without that livestock system, cropping would really not be sustainable. I'd like to, again, to raise a little bit of, I can come across as very negative on a lot of these things, but Mr. Ritchie's comments about, we can feed the world, it's not a problem. I'm a skeptic on that. Current conventional agriculture is overwhelmingly dependent on fossil fuel. Nitrogen fertilizer, on which so much of our crop yield is dependent on fossil fuel for its production. Our mechanized farming is fossil fuel dependent. Phosphate. Across Africa, many African soils, phosphorus is the first limiting nutrient in terms of crop production. It is a non-renewable resource. We can't keep on mining the stuff and just scattering it willy-nilly. So, I think, we have to be very careful about the broad sweeping statements that we can do it. On the organic farming side, I did like Mr. Ritchie's description of that sort of integrated farm involving livestock.
I think, sorry, we have to kind of.
Sorry, I'll leave it at that. I mean, I've got a lot more things that I would like to say, but let me leave it there.
But yeah, I think your view is very interesting, and I am from the global south, so I do kind of hear your sentiments on that. But I think the main idea behind our society is something more Edinburgh centric. We always believe that it kind of starts with the community. And I guess at that, we will just take a 3-minute break and come back at 8:05, and we'll just kind of address the rest of our remaining speakers, Emma and Lyndsay, with a few questions before we end the session. All right, so just grab a cup of tea, maybe leave for a few moments and come back and just get in a relaxing position.
Thanks, Julian.
And thank you for speaking, all of you. It's been really insightful hearing your views.
Thank you. Nice to meet you, Emma.
All right, if everyone could just come back and we can just kind of finish off the last few minutes of the session. We have quite a few questions to go through. I will try my best to go through everything, but I also understand that time is not on our side. Okay. I'm just checking. Lyndsay, are you with us now? Sorry, you're on mute.
Of course. Sorry, I lost my Wi-Fi. I'm hotspotting for my phone, so.
That happens to all of us at some point. But okay, we'll just get back to the questions. There was one from Ronan, and he was saying, hi there. I was wondering if the speakers could address the issue of the high cost that of vegan and healthy diets more generally have for a majority of the population, and that there are a lot of cultural factors to be taken into account when we speak of what healthy diets mean to different people. Thank you.
I suppose
I'll take that first.
I'll
Yeah.
chip in as the layman, and then so yeah, this is a question that I get asked a lot. Actually, people say to me, "Oh, you're vegan? Oh gosh, that's really expensive." But you have to be careful if you are buying foods that are specifically marketed as vegan. A lot of the processed food that Lyndsay was talking about, if you're buying like avocados and more expensive vegetables, and yes, it certainly can be, but I find that I eat a lot of beans, I eat a lot of lentils, I eat a lot of rice, and if you get those in tins or dried, they are quite affordable. I know that obviously comes with a lot of privilege. I have a kitchen and with a working oven and stuff that I can cook those foods in. So yes, I do definitely think that there is a larger kind of social issue that needs to be addressed. I also kind of want to flag as well, I think here in Edinburgh we are incredibly lucky with the choice of food that we have. I think most of us in the city, I know that I'm personally very close to a big supermarket that has all the choice that I could ever want. But if I go over to my parents in Fife, who live in a relatively small town, the choice very quickly diminishes. So yeah, there's definitely issues around that. But the glamorous avocado on toast that you see on Instagram, it's kind of touted as healthy food. I mean, there are kind of more, maybe slightly less glamorous foods like like dals and stuff that can be just as nutritious, but aren't Instagrammable. And I think maybe that's partly where a lot of this kind of perception comes from.
Yeah, I'll maybe just tag on to that because there's another question about price there for US versus UK. And, there are two observations I've noticed. Meat here is much more expensive than the US. So meat products in the US are ridiculous. Because of high subsidies, the price of meat is incredibly low. And so I think the differential in the US may be more with vegan diets being more expensive, particularly if you go for the substitute products. But I've noticed here, for some reason, I divide the plant protein alternatives into two categories: the ultra processed, which are the biomimicry products, like the corn products that are like mincemeat but not meat, like the fake meats, and then they're the like processed but not ultra processed. So those are like tofu, tempeh, seitan, like those kinds of wheat and soy based products that have been around for over 1,000 years in different cultures. I find that those products, which are really a staple in my diet when I'm in the US, they're harder to find here than the biomimicry products, and they're more expensive. So just buying like firm tofu it seems to be really expensive here compared to buying like the corn like substitutes. But maybe I'm just shopping at the wrong grocery stores, although I shop at a variety of grocery stores because I'm curious about these things. The other thing I've noticed is quite a lot more expensive here is nuts. I think that one really nutrient dense option here and all around the world are nut butters, whether it be peanut butter or almond butter or whatever the nut product is. So we see nut consumption, like peanut butter consumption and peanut consumption really high in a lot of places around the world. And I think promotion of that with really good hearty bread is a great option for nutrition, as long as you don't have a bunch of added sugar in your nut butter. But I've found that those are also really expensive here. So I've struggled. I'm just going to pack my suitcase full of them the next time I am able to come go back and forth. So yeah, I think there have been some differences. I think that when I think about this issue, cost, as I said, is the #1 driver of what people eat by far. And I think that's universal. We found that in drivers of food choice studies in Malawi and India, in the US, I suspect in the UK. All of our research studies show that cost is a main driver. And I think that the problem is that the time cost of eating cheap vegetarian food is high. And so you can buy dried beans, but the time cost of cooking dried beans is quite high. And so I think that that's kind of the problem I see, is that this, especially for people who are working multiple, I'm not as familiar with the situation here, but in the US, a lot of people are working 2 jobs, which means they're working 16 hours a day, tag on commuting and commuting times, and they're like, when are they going to cook? They're not going to cook. And so they don't have the time cost, I think, is a big barrier to eating cheap vegetarian food. And so if you don't have the time, I do think that vegetarian food can be more expensive. The ready to eat vegetarian.
All right, thank you, thank you. I think a lot of international students can relate with when someone says we want to bring some food back from home. It's just
Yeah, I know. My suitcase is like peanut butter, nuts from Trader Joe's, really good like dry ciders, which I haven't been able to find good like hard cider in the UK. It's all really sugary to me. So anyway, yeah, I've got a long list.
not really a cider person, but thank you. I guess like there was one interesting question. I think Pete kind of answered it, but I thought we could just direct it to you two as well. It's like, do you think it would ever be possible to achieve veganism on a global scale? If yes, do you see any major environmental problems that could arise from that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to take a quick stab if that's all right, Emma, and then I'll pass it over to you. Just quickly, I don't think that that's ever going to happen. And I don't necessarily know that that's a world I necessarily want to live in. And again, this is all a value judgment, but I do think that there's space for people who want to eat animal source products and who, you know, can't achieve food security otherwise. As Paul, or the person who was speaking before, said, you know, there are people who do need to consume animal source foods. He mentioned somewhere in sub-Saharan Africa, I think, but also, you know, I was living in China for a brief period of time, and certainly in Inner Mongolia, it's the same thing. There's no way you're going to be growing crops there. And so livestock and dairy are staple foods, and you can't have food, and you can't have food security without them in that context. So I don't think that I want to live in a world where all humans are vegan. But, you know, I do think that's a value-based decision. I think the world would be a better place maybe if more of us who could afford to and had, you know, that preference could do that. I think that would be a good thing. But everyone, all 9 billion of us eventually, yeah, I think it takes all kinds of people to make a world.
Well, obviously I would like to live in a world where everyone was vegan. But I totally agree. I think, yeah, as Paul kind of alluded to, you know, obviously, like, I'm vegan because I can be vegan, and it's it's fairly easy for me to be vegan as well. But, you know, I can't speak for, you know, the world, because, you know, as you say, there's a variety of situations, there's a variety of cultures. So yeah, I agree. I think, you know, I hope that meat and dairy consumption and veganism will go down, and veganism will rise, obviously. But the figure I quoted from the Drawdown book was running on an assumption that it would be 50% of the global population. So it's not like everybody has to do it to see these benefits. But again, I think that whenever people kind of say that to me, I'm like, well, I can be vegan and it aligns with my values, so I am vegan. And if more people kind of went that way, then I think that would be good. But I think, like, obviously, like, nobody's going to flip a switch and the world's going to go vegan overnight and cause like all this kind of, like, because the food chain has to change overnight. If it is going to change, then it's going to be it's going to be gradual. But from what I've seen, just kind of in my kind of own experience, and certainly kind of here in Edinburgh, there has definitely been a massive sea change in the last, like, about 3 or 4 years in it. So it's going in the right direction, but will it happen completely? Will it happen overnight? Even I'm like, no, it's not going to happen.
Thank you. I guess it always just goes on. People are so different and we're so diverse, and sometimes we should celebrate diversity, but we should also always know what the general impact of our choices have on the environment and those around us as well. This next question is quite long, but I'll just have at it. Coming from the Edinburgh perspective, although we may be able to, I think means give access to lots of foods, based on what Pete talked about with Scotland having not a lot of land to grow crops, what do you have to say about plant-based diet, meaning lots of foods being shipped from long distance? This surely has a large carbon footprint. Have you seen a movement within the vegan or vegetarian community to encourage more local vegetable consumption? I think this one's more aimed towards you, Emma.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's one of those things that kind of does sometimes irk me at the back of my head when I'm making food choices. Vegan is one of the kind of benefits I find from veganism. It's probably not one of the most common ones you cite, but veganism for me is like a kind of paradigm where I make all my decisions. And so part of that is that a lot of decisions are made for me. So I'm not having to kind of spend brain power kind of you know, looking at a menu in a restaurant. If there's only one vegan option there, then, you know, I'll pick that one vegan option. Likewise, there are entire aisles in the supermarket that I will just walk by. And my that kind of framework, the vegan framework that I apply to my decision making, I know that on the whole, it will mean that my carbon footprint on my diet will probably be smaller than if I was to have a meat-eating, high red meat omnivore diet. However, I do know that there are individual foods that are vegan that are still very problematic, whether it is, you know, avocados. I keep bashing avocados tonight. I don't know why.
Avocados up.
But yeah, whether it's like avocados that are being flown from, you know, South America, Mexico, across the Atlantic to get to us, or eating berries that are, you know, out of season, and, you know, again, they have to be shipped long distances. It is definitely something that I am kind of, I do think about, and certainly, like, in a lot of the restaurants that I tend to go to, you know, seasonality, there's definitely been a kind of move towards seasonality. I think that, yeah, I think that a lot of vegans, not all of them, but there are a lot of vegans that are very conscious about you know, looking at what's in season. And again, it comes back to this cost thing, like, you know, veg that's in season tends to be cheaper than, you know, for veg that's out of season. So but a lot of vegans, and many vegans are not vegan for the environmental aspect, even though that is a benefit. But there are, I mean, we do tend to be quite a socially conscious bunch in general. So it is something that we're thinking about. But I think as well, I think there's a lot to be done in terms of kind of making people more conscious about that stuff. I think, Lyndsay, I think there might have been something in your slide about the environmental labelling. I'd love to see that. I'd love to see like a mandatory kind of labelling system like we have for like washing machines or white goods, that actually, you know, talk about not like, you know, the land use, the carbon footprint, impact on biodiversity, you know, water waste, that kind of thing. And so that it would be just so much easier to kind of make these decisions, because again, for people who are like really time poor and having to kind of go around the supermarket, they just kind of need to grab what they need to grab. And this information is not always, you know, even like things that like foods that are exactly the same, that look the same, might have massively different, you know, impacts depending on where they've come from, how they've been, you know, processed, how they've been made. So so that information can be quite difficult sometimes to come by. But yeah, I do try my best. On that front, I know I probably could go better. I do get the avocado guilt sometimes. I treat myself to an avocado and I do feel incredibly guilty about it. But yeah, I know that kind of on the whole, it probably works out better than if I had an omnivore diet that was high in red meat and everything.
I might just chime in there to relieve some of your guilt. So again, US-centric study, but there has been some study out of Penn that if you ate your diet 100%, every calorie that went in your body within a 100-mile radius, you would reduce your carbon footprint by the same amount as reducing meat for one day, or eliminating meat for one day. So it just like the elimination of livestock products is so huge relative to the transport costs. Even if you're flying avocados from California, where the state is burning to the ground with wildfires related to climate change, it's you know, it's so small compared to eating livestock products. So you're doing the right thing.
Thank you. That makes me feel so much better.
I do love that resolution because I also love avocados, and I just had one just before the event. I was rather feeling rebuked. But someone did post an interesting link with data that goes into details about animal products and interesting facts around transportation. I think everyone should have a look at that. Do we have any more questions? I think we've got time to fit one more in.
If there's not one more, I might just chime in with one more follow-up to something that Emma said about the labels, the environmental labels. I think that our work so far is showing that the labels are good. They give consumers information, and that's usually how you can get them passed, because companies know they're not going to really change people's behavior, so they're happy to stick them on there, like the nutrition labels. So I think that what we're kind of shifting gears towards in our research group, because the labels don't seem to be very effective, they're not going to get us the 50% reduction by 2040, surely, is cost. And can we modify the cost of food such that the negative externalities related to the environment are included in the cost? And that means also that the price of vegetarian items will go down. And so can we, you know, shift things around so that it's easier, and cost is the number one determinant of the purchase. So, you know, I think much of our work now is trying to understand, like, what is the sweet spot for costing around meat. We're focusing on meat products right now, but, you know, if the carbon footprint of food products was included in the cost, I think you would see a big difference. One of the things that we're trying to figure out now is whether or not the labeling and the costing should be within categories or across the whole store. So like within fruit, should we try to nudge people to the best fruit, and then within meat to the best meat? Or should it just be trying to get people out of the meat aisle entirely? and every other aisle is green and the meat aisle is red. So we're kind of trying to play around with what that experiment should look like. But the labeling, I think, is useful for information and for people who are already informed. An environmental label doesn't mean anything if you don't even know that food has an impact on the environment, which not many people do outside of this, Zoom call. In the general public, few people even know about that link. So I think that the labels are useful, but they're only going to get us so far.
If there were sorry, now I'm asking questions. If there were mandatory labels, though, do you think that it would encourage the producers who do have bad labeling actually up their game a bit so that it doesn't look as bad on their labels? It's just, as I said, when I was reading about the whole kind of labeling thing, I was reading about washing machines and white goods, that the EU imposed this mandatory energy consumption, and it was only something like 20 or 30% of consumers who actually cared. But because a lot of these washing machines were coming in at rating D to G, they were just well, if we're sitting next to in a shop with a rating A, then we might as well kind of sharpen our game a little bit. And now actually, just from that kind of pressure from that side, it's actually a lot, the impact has gone a lot up to A double star, AAA star. So do you think actually, even if it wasn't from a consumer's perspective, maybe it would encourage the suppliers to find efficiencies in their side of things?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that the thing we struggle with that is that it's hard to think of what the substitute. It might lead to a lot of meat substitute, these ultra processed meat substitutes in products. I think that the problem is that when you're in a meat aisle, there's no, they're all going to be D. There's no real wiggle room there, unless maybe you consider other things, not just necessarily the carbon footprint, because it's inherently going to be large for all animal products. But it's kind of like the burrito experiment, right? Where you're going to go to the burrito shelf and there's going to be a frozen burrito that has a D, and then the chicken one's going to be C, and then there's a bean one with cheese that's B, and then the bean one without cheese is A or something. And so I just don't see them maybe they'll just drop the beef burrito from their product line. I'm not sure, but it'll be interesting to see what that looks like, because I think it's going to be a little bit harder to reformulate products, but I don't know. I think it's a really interesting area of research. So stay tuned.
And I just want to say as well, I intentionally did not talk about health in my little bit, because as you just say, you can have a vegan diet, but it does not give you in any way a free pass. And I thought your stats on the processed stuff was very, very interesting. So so it was a very, very interesting talk from you, so thanks.
Oh, thank you. I really appreciate your website.
All right. Oh, thank you. I guess the only certainty we have when it comes to these things is that there's always going to be uncertainty. But quickly, just as a last point before we end this, someone just wanted clarification on the concept of the 100 food mile radius versus eliminating animal products for one day. Is it based on US or UK data? If you could just.
It was a US study. Yeah. Discount the farming system of the animal products. So unfortunately not. This is the big limitation of all of these big studies. They usually use the average life cycle assessment score. So the LCA across all beef products is an average. Like the Oxford study, I think, Emma, that you're mentioning, I probably know the one you're thinking of. And so they explicitly mention in that Oxford paper, for example, that for beef, there's a huge range actually of what the carbon footprint of a kg of beef is. And they take the midpoint. I actually don't know if they take the average or the median, but I should know that, but I don't. So anyway, there's a huge range, and it's the midpoint. So unfortunately, there's not a weighted system for the average American has this much grass-fed, free range beef and this much from CAFOs, and we don't know that, and so they just take the midpoint.
Thank you. And I think it's okay that you don't know. I think today I had a stats exam, so to those numbers, it's not being too coherent, but thank you. I'd like to thank both of you, Emma and Lyndsay. I think the session has been really insightful, but I think we have to draw it to a close now.
Yeah, thank you so much for the invitation. Really nice to meet you, Emma, and thanks everyone for joining.